Humans of the cardboard. Today, I'm giving you 5 decks that I think are the best decks to approach the modern competitive game with. The game is so fast these days. Whether you are somebody who's coming over from a different card game, different competitive scene, and you want to get into the Yu-Gi-Oh side of it because you've heard it's good, it's different, it's faster, whatever, or you are somebody who has played what I like to call like GOAT style. Uh, Yu-Gi-Oh, where even if you weren't playing officially GOAT format, you were playing like a much slower version of the game where it's a lot of normal summon attack, do stuff like that. And so I think it's good to have a good base couple of decks to kind of look at. And this probably changes every couple of years, maybe even every year, every couple months, even because my 3 criteria that I kind of based on that were most important to me when I made this list were one, the play style of the archetypes, right? I don't want them to be super combo heavy. I don't want them to be super convoluted with weird interactions or, just weird mechanics that they take advantage of, because that's not really going to help a player getting used to the fast competitive scene, get used to all the other stuff around them. Two, it's the strength. I still want to be able to give a player, if you're trying to get them used to the modern format that is super fast, super, powerful and everything, you need to be giving them a deck that's still somewhat competent. So I want at least rogue or better in these picks. It's also hard to expect somebody to pick a deck up, play it for a couple months, and be getting their ass kicked for a couple months and like still want to stick with it as like a trust the process kind of scenario. So I still think having something that if you're playing it well, playing it right, building it right, you should still be coming out of it with some relative success, and I think that can help build for more long-term enjoyment of the game. And lastly is accessibility. This is a huge one. As somebody who's just coming to the competitive scene of Yu-Gi-Oh for the first time, you cannot expect them to shell out 500 to $1,000 for these top level meta decks. And that's why a lot of these aren't like top level, especially the way you might be able to build them on a budget. But I do think all 5 of these have solid rogue potential that still give them relative accessibility. The budget I was working on here was under $100, and most of these don't even get that close to it. You'll see I even show you the budget on the main cores that I would recommend to like start off with these decks. So other than that, the reason I like doing 5 options here is, I think there's important things in Yu-Gi-Oh, which is like the play style of some of these decks. You can look at them and be like, I don't like the way this one is kind of working. I want to pick a different one, and even aesthetically, that's something I'm big on. I've seen decks that I really like the way they play, but the aesthetic of them is just kind of cringe or just not my current like my favorite flavor, so I stay away from them. I think that's important too, to enjoy what you're playing with, enjoy the artwork, because the artwork is one of the coolest things about Yu-Gi-Oh. So I've given you 5 picks. You can pick any 5 of these. I put them kind of in a rough order of how much I like them on this list, but they're all on the list for a reason, and you could pick any of them. And I think they'd be a good option to kind of get started into the competitive scene. So I've gotten all the basic stuff out of the way. Let's finally get into our first archetype here. The first one here is Sharks. I think this one's pretty cool. I know it's mainly just Exceed based, but it's still pretty linear, and it has some kind of more inclusive, like a further combo lines that goes a little crazier sometimes, but you can also build it a very straightforward linear version that just is doing what it does very well. You're making Bahamets, you're making Toads, you're making your other shark boss monsters, you're making your Kragans and everything like that. But the support they've gotten recently is just really solid, and I think giving them somebody the option of this kind of flavor of water undersea stuff, I think people really enjoy that. There are some barriers though, and even though I like this as an option to get started, which I do think you can still play a totally competent version without some of these cards, it's important to note: seventh Tachyon, this card is expensive as hell. It's like $75 a copy. I know it just came out, and down the line it'll get cheaper, it'll get reprints, or you save up money to get it to improve the version of the deck you're playing. But this is definitely a downside, because this would be in the best version of the deck, in my opinion. Same thing with Seventh Ascension. This is an older card that hasn't been reprinted in quite a long time. This card sits at $40. This might also be included in the best version of the deck. So there's stuff like that that I think kind of holds you back in terms of the budget side of things. But I think you can still play a totally competent version aside from these anyway, with stuff like Small World. And the last kind of like con, I guess we would call it here, is the potential of catching strays from Mermail. Mermail is a lot of people are projecting that Mermail could get hit on the next ban list that's about to drop in the TCG, and I've seen people project Moulin Glacier. I've seen people project Coelacanth. I've seen people project Barrier Statue. I've also seen people project Totally Awesome or Bahamut Shark to end up on the list as well. The other ones wouldn't really affect us, but these two specifically could affect us, depending on how they choose to hit them, right? If they just banned Bahamut Shark straight up, that would be a huge hit to the deck. If it went to 1, not that big a deal. If Toad goes to 1, not that big of a deal. But if they choose to ban either, it would be a significant hit to this deck. So that's another potential con here to keep an eye on down the line. But I still think for right now, still a pretty good option, all things considered. And then looking at our budget here, this is kind of the core I recommend to mess around picking up out the gate. Let me move my fat head so you can see whatever's in the corner. I know I have a lot of cards in the extra deck. This doesn't have to be your 15 card extra, of course, but even just, even just like for a basic core that I think what makes the most sense for Sharks. There's a lot of other cards you can play in Sharks, but that stuff's not even going to be that expensive aside from the big ones we already mentioned. But this core, as you can see, is going to be like totally, oh shoot, I cut off. Oh, it's actually above. Hold on. There we go. Comes out to like 25-ish dollars. So you're sub 30 on this core, which is phenomenal for a deck that I think like can totally top a regional like right this second. I think that's a pretty good scoop to kind of jump on. So Sharks definitely number 5 on the list for me. Next up, let's talk about Fire Kings. This one is very interesting. It just won a YCS a couple months ago. Shout out to Dinkabooey. He is insane. I don't know how he did it, but it proves that the deck is still good enough to hang around. One of the biggest pros of this is it came in a structure deck. So aside from specifically one card, and it's basically the only con for looking at this one, is there's one card that didn't make it in the structure deck. That's very important, especially for a pure version of this deck. But being in a structure deck means you can either buy three structure decks, or even as singles, they're probably really cheap as well. It's very easy to kind of pick up your core for this deck and have 90% of it aside from Volcanics. Unfortunately, Volcanics was printed as a secret rare in a core set as the final support card here. So that's like $20 a copy. You're going to need 3 of that. But as you'll see in the budget, everything else is so cheap, you still come in under $100, even dropping $60 on this card alone. So building the deck overall is still totally doable. And then lastly, like, it gives you another aesthetic. The first aesthetic we looked at was water. This one's kind of fire based, which is kind of cool. Everybody has their own personal flavor. I like having that diversity here. Looking at the overall budget here, again, because of the structure deck, the singles are so cheap on these cards that even with like $60 for the playset of Volcanics, you still end up like under $75 overall. Here, there's not much extra deck stuff going on. There's a couple other rank 8s you could look at, but these are really the 2 main extra deck cards that matter. Heat has more of like a generic staple. That's another thing too. I'm showing you deck cores. I think that's maybe an entirely separate discussion for another day, which would be like, if you had a certain budget, what would I recommend for your budget to just start getting like your generic staple cards set aside for you? You know what? This is just becoming such a pain. Let me just shrink my fat head down here in the corner. All right. But yeah, I think Fire Kings is another great option. And I think it's also really slow, doesn't use the extra deck much, very like resource oriented, grind game oriented, which I think is really good, and helps kind of bridge older players into the faster game. And I think it's a really good option here. Moving on. Next option we have here is Orcust. Another flavor. We're going for like dark as opposed to water and fire. Now we're into dark, which is very cool. A lot of people love like the dark aesthetic. This one is super cheap. It's so cheap. It's crazy. You'll see when we actually get to the core. It's an older archetype, so this one kind of makes sense. But the core right now is so cheap. And I like this one because it'll get older players used to using like the graveyard and banish zone much more frequently, which is just so much more common in modern day Yu-Gi-Oh! It's just something that didn't get utilized, not never, but not on the same level as it is now. So this is a good one to kind of help bridge that gap of getting used to using those areas of the game. One thing to keep in mind, and I think this is like a positive / negative. It could be either, I think, but they have 2 new cards of support coming out in about 2.5 months at the time this video is going up. 2.5, 3 months, something like that. When they come, this deck is going to take another leap into legit tiered play. And so I think it's a negative, obviously, in that if you were to pick it up and then, immediately after seeing this video right now, you would have to wait for the deck to be like fully playable like that. The positive, though, is it allows you to kind of ramp up into it. You can play basically Orcust from 3 4 years ago, get used to like that older but still like a progression from where you're probably used to, and then as the new cards come out, you then get to like kind of level up into that full on super fast version that's going to be a real competitive threat at that point. So they get a new link 1, they get a new link 4. It's very link oriented strategy, which is very common in modern day, so it's good to get used to that. And I think this one makes a lot of sense there. One of the other downsides with having to kind of wait is if you want this deck to be playable until then, you may have to also invest in a side engine. Fiendsmith is super expensive. Horus is pretty expensive as well. That Horus actually still may fit in the budget just because it's the core itself is like under $30 for now. Especially not knowing how expensive the 2 new cards are going to be. There's other stuff like Runic as well, which can work, and you'll play it as a very fringe rogue deck until the new cards come out, but it helps you kind of level up into that speed. And the last like kind of con, I guess we'll call it, for this archetype is catching strays from Malice. We're worried that Sharks could potentially catch strays from Mermail. Orcust is probably going to catch some strays from Malice. Malice is one of the best decks in the game. It is very common in almost every like competitive player's side deck to have Artifact Lancia, to have, Mulcharmy Meows. And dealing with those is going to be kind of annoying because they're going to be everywhere just because of Malice, and you're going to start, feeling those repercussions as well, which aren't even your fault. So I play Crystron. That's a big draw on Crystron right now that kind of makes it rough. Is Lancia's rough, Dweller's rough. Same idea here. That being said, I still think it's good enough. I still think it can grind like crazy, and I like Orcust overall going forward. So I think this one makes quite a lot of sense. Looking at our budget standpoint here, the overall, look at that, $30 is the most here when you're looking at for the total here. That's crazy. You know what I mean? $30 overall basically for the entire core. Obviously, this is pre the new links coming out, but this gives you a really good standpoint to kind of work off of just in terms of what you're expecting to pay out on your initial investment on a deck like this. So it's really cool. It's nice that this one's a lot older for sure. Number 2 on our list, Kashtira. Yeah, this one, I don't even know if there's really any cons for this one. I guess the main con to me is that this one, as a pure variant, maybe the worst deck on this list, right? Orcus, when they get their new support, it's going to be legit. Fire King and Sharks are legit solid rogue decks. Blue, well, we'll get to the last one, but the last one is quite highly tiered as well. This one's probably the worst deck to play as a pure deck, but you can start off pure, playing more of that like kind of super control stun style of Kashtira, and then as you get more comfortable with it and you get more adjusted to the current meta game, you can splash other engines in. That's a really cool aspect about this one, is that this is a more long-term investment. You buy these other engines, you buy these other cores for the other 4 options on here. When you move on from that deck and you say, oh, a new deck came out, I feel more confident as a player, I want to pick up a new deck, you may not use those cards for a long time. Kashtira is different in that you could play another deck that still potentially down the line wants to splash the Kashtira engine. And so you're kind of investing in a cool side engine that you could play in other decks, not just its own. So I think that's a really cool aspect here. It's also the simplest to play, so it's probably the most approachable deck, maybe aside from Fire King here on this list, as far as if you are used to straight up like, you know, goat format, very slow style, this deck still does not do a ton on its turns, and I think plays that simplistic style. And of course, combining with other decks down the line, investment, all that stuff. The only thing that's kind of annoying is some people don't like that stun style. The stun aspect that Kashtira can have, but I think it's still a good place to start. So all right, looking out here on our deck core, again, you do get closer to $90 here. This one, maybe you could argue this one being on the higher end. You're still under $100, so I don't mind it that much, especially since you're getting a longer term investment here. Looking at the core here, seems pretty simple. This is even with like 3 Rise Hearts, which you may maybe play in the pure variant, but in other variants you're like never playing 3 of this, so like that's not even an absolute necessity depending on the variant you're looking at. I even have Shifter here. If you're going to play a more pure build, Shifter seems crazy. And then of course you have your Exceed monsters that come up the most in a deck like this. So yeah, still staying under 100. Love that. And I think Kashtira really just doesn't have many downsides on it. I think it may make the most sense overall, but it's up to the individual player on what they like the most from these. All right, and number 1, I think this one's just too perfect not to just absolutely praise. We got a Blue Eye structure deck. As you saw from Fire King, structure decks are disgusting. They're so good. They make for a very quick and easy and cheap deck to build. And a lot of times, Konami's done a really good job in most cases of making them like immediately competitively relevant. Blue Eyes now sits as like probably the 4th or 5th best deck in the game currently, and basically just on the back of the structure deck. A little bit other stuff as well, but like it's a real deck. All right, what are the pros? It's a structure deck, obviously, that makes it super cheap, super affordable. You'll see that with our budget. One of the pros too for this, for a newer player that's getting used to modern Yu-Gi-Oh style, is this deck uses link summons, it uses synchro summons, it uses fusion summons. There's even an Exceed that you can play. Most lists don't play it, but you could even play that if you're playing a more simple version to kind of just get used to that. You kind of get a little bit of introduction on every extra deck summoning mechanic that really matters, and that's really nice. That's really nice. On top of that, there is a bunch of really cool variants you can play of different Blue Eyes versions. So obviously Primite's the big one. We'll talk about that in the cons, but whether you're looking at Buster Blader Blue Eyes, which has a, I believe, YCS top now, Invoked Blue Eyes. I've seen people mess around with it on the Rogue level. There's multiple different versions. So even when you play the pure version, you're like, okay, I want to try another version out. You have more runway with it to keep it fresh, to keep it fun, and keep evolving until you have the ability to shell out for the Primite engine. Aether Barrel and Lordly Load are super expensive. It stinks, but it is what it is. Luckily, we already have a Lordly Load reprint announced, so hopefully that comes sooner than later. And that is actually like it's a fairly approachable price, sooner than later, but we'll see. And then looking at our budget here, very cheap. This is insane. So this is for like a very pure variant, obviously. And this maybe gives you enough runway where if you have enough budget to shell out for the Primite cards, you may be able to get like the full absolute competitive version of this deck like very quickly, because this is so cheap, because establishing the overall core for this deck is so freaking easy. It's so doable. So Blue Eyes, to me, it has no downsides other than the Primite engine being pretty expensive for now. A couple months down the line, Lordly Load will be a lot more affordable theoretically. And the only other downside I would say is like maybe mirror matches. If you just don't like playing against your same deck, that's kind of annoying. It is Blue Eyes, and as much as it being Blue Eyes makes it very popular and a lot of people love it, that's also the downside. A lot of people love it, so a lot of people are going to be playing it, and you're probably going to run into a hefty number of mirror matches overall. So, but if you're okay with that, obviously that's not even a downside. It's just a small thing to note. Well, there you go. That's everything. Those to me are the 5 best decks. If you are trying to get started in Yu-Gi-Oh, I would take a look at all 5 of these, do some research on them, mess around with them, pick your favorite flavor. You've got Light Dragons. You've got, let's see, you've got Light Dragons here to start. You've got Kashtira, which is kind of all over the place, in terms of design and type and attribute and everything. Then you have Dark Machines with Orcust. Then you get to Fire with Fire Kings, and then of course Water with Sharks. You kind of have a bunch of different flavors. You can pick your favorite, but I think they're all not equally, but very closely approachable in their own ways. And I think they're all a good option to kind of get started with on the competitive scene. So there you go. That's my video. Let me know your thoughts down below. Let me know down below what you would pick if you were starting Yu-Gi-Oh! Here. Let me know if there's other options as well. There's so many archetypes in Yu-Gi-Oh! I'm not saying these are the definitive 5 for sure, no doubt. There were other ones I considered, but if you had any others that you also think make sense, I'd throw them in the comment section down below. I'd be curious to hear what you say there. But I'm out of here for today. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next video. Subscribe to the channel for more stuff like this down the line, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.